All right, today we're jumping into one of the most explosive events in all of history, the French Revolution. And let me tell you, this was so much more than just a political shakeup. It completely redefined what power is, what rights people have, and what it even means to be a citizen.
And you know, the whole thing really boils down to this one huge question. What does it actually take to bring down a king? Well, the French Revolution gives us maybe the most dramatic and, yeah, the bloodiest answer in the history books. So, let's get into it.
Okay, so to really get why this explosion happened, you've got to understand the powder keg it was sitting on. We're talking about France before the revolution, what historians call the Ancien Régime, or the Old Rule. And this kingdom? Oh, it was an absolute mess, just teetering on the brink of total collapse.
And right at the heart of all this trouble was a social structure that was, well, just ridiculously unfair. Society was split into three groups, called estates. And the kicker? The moment you were born, your entire life, your opportunities, your future, it was all decided for you. No way out.
So let's break this down. You had the first estate, that's the clergy. Then the second estate, the nobility. Now get this, together, they made up a teensy-tiny fraction of the population, but they owned almost all the land and had all the perks. And then there was the third estate. And who is that? Literally everyone else. We're talking 97% of the entire country, from the poorest farmer to a city merchant.
This right here, this shows you just how insane the situation was. So, who was footing the bill for the entire kingdom? The clergy and the nobles? No, they paid pretty much nothing in taxes. Can you believe that? The entire financial weight of France was crushing the third estate, the people who had the least money and absolutely no say in how things were run. It's just wild. And it gets worse. On top of that crazy inequality, you've got King Louis XVI, an absolute monarch who did whatever he wanted. The government was completely broke, partly from paying for expensive wars. Yeah, like helping out with the American Revolution. Then, as if that wasn't enough, harvest failed. And that meant the price of bread, the one thing most people ate every single day, just shot through the roof. People weren't just poor, they were actually starving.
So let's recap. You've got a country that's broke, the people are hungry, and the whole system is fundamentally unfair. It's the perfect storm. And right into the middle of this mess, a bunch of new, radical ideas start catching on like wildfire.
This was a period we call the Age of Enlightenment. You had all these brilliant thinkers and writers who started to question everything. They looked at the way the world was run, with kings claiming God gave them the right to rule, and they said, wait a minute, does this actually make any sense? They were cooking up a whole new way of thinking about society.
Okay, first up is this bombshell of an idea, popular sovereignty. Thinkers like Rousseau put this out there, and it was world-changing. The idea was that a government's power doesn't come from God, it comes from the people it governs. And here's the really dangerous part for a king. If the people are the source of power, they can also decide to take that power back. Next, people started demanding what we'd now call civil liberties. Guys like Voltaire were making the case that every single person is born with basic rights that no government can touch. You know, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all the stuff that was basically impossible under the old system.
And finally, a philosopher named Montesquieu came along with a practical blueprint for how a better government could work. He called it the separation of powers. The idea is simple but brilliant. You split the government into different branches, one that makes laws, one that enforces them, and one that judges them. Why? To make sure no single person or group could ever get too powerful and become a tyrant. It was a game plan for a whole new system.
So the powder keg was ready to blow, and the intellectual match was lit. The revolution finally ignites. But here's the thing, it wasn't some neat, tidy event. Oh no, it was a decade of chaos, of violence, a totally unpredictable storm.
To make sense of the chaos, we can kind of break it down into three stages. First, you have a pretty moderate phase. Then things get really intense and bloody in the radical phase. And finally, there's a reactionary phase, where everyone's basically trying to slam on the brakes. Let's take a quick look at each one.
So, it all kicks off in 1789, and at first, there was a lot of hope in the air. The king calls this big meeting the Estates General, but the Third Estate just takes over, declares itself a national assembly, and then you have the famous storming of the Bastille prison. They even put out this incredible document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which was all about these new ideas of liberty and equality.
But that hope didn't last long. The king was fighting the changes every step of the way. Other kings in Europe are getting really nervous this revolutionary fever might spread.
and the more radical voices in Paris were yelling for more, much more. Things started to spiral, getting more and more extreme.
And you can see the goalposts just completely shift. At the start, the idea was, hey, let's just limit the king's power with a constitution. Kind of like what they had in Britain. But that changed fast. The new radical goal? Forget limiting the king. Let's get rid of the monarchy entirely.
And that brings us to the radical phase. In 1792, they did it. They abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. Then in 1793, they took the unbelievable step of publicly executing their own king, Louis XVI, with the guillotine. That event kicked off the most infamous chapter of all, the Reign of Terror. A guy named Robespierre was in charge, and thousands upon thousands of people accused of being enemies of the revolution were sent to the guillotine. It was a bloodbath.
Eventually, even the revolutionaries got sick of all the killing. Robespierre himself ended up at the guillotine, and the revolution swung back the other way into its final phase. But this period was just a mess of instability and corruption. It created this huge power vacuum. And who steps into that vacuum? A brilliant, ambitious young general you've probably heard of, Napoleon Bonaparte.
So think about that for a second. The revolution that started to get rid of a king ended with an emperor. So what was the point? Why do we still talk about it so much? Well, because even though it failed in some ways, its ideas completely changed the world. And we are still living with the results.
The legacy is just huge, but we can boil it down to 3 massive changes. First, it completely destroyed the idea that kings were chosen by God. It was the beginning of the end for absolute rule in Europe. Second, it turned people from being subjects, who just had to obey, into citizens, people with actual rights and a say. And third, it lit the fuse on this powerful new idea called nationalism, the belief that a nation is its people, not just whoever happens to be wearing the crown. I mean, just look at the ideas that were unleashed. All these concepts that are the absolute bedrock of modern democracy. The idea that power comes from the people, that everyone is equal before the law, that politics should be based on rights. We kind of take them for granted now, but the revolution is what really blasted them out into the world.
But let's be real, it wasn't all good. We absolutely cannot forget the dark side. The insane violence of the Reign of Terror is still a scary warning about how revolutions can go wrong. And all this talk about rights, well, that didn't include women, and it didn't include a lot of the poor either. Plus, the whole thing kicked off decades of absolutely brutal wars across Europe. It was a really messy, violent, and complicated beginning for our modern world.
And that leads us with this really tough question, doesn't it? The revolution's famous motto was Liberté, Equality, Fraternity. Freedom, equality, brotherhood. But it also delivered terror, war, and a dictator. So it makes you wonder, what is the real price for changing the world? And is it always worth it? That's a question people have been wrestling with ever since.